Could you drink a cup of wine mixed with the dust of a 3,000-year-old corpse to cure a headache? Would you cover your face in a white paste made from lead, knowing it was slowly seeping into your skin? What if your doctor told you the only way to save your unborn child was to bleed you, draining the very life you were trying to preserve? For the most powerful women in history, for queens and empresses, these were not wild hypotheticals. This was medicine. They were surrounded by luxury, but their doctors were armed with theories that were often more dangerous than the diseases they were meant to treat. The pressure to produce an heir, to look eternally youthful, and to simply survive was immense, and it pushed them and their physicians to try almost anything. Number 17 was a flawless face worth a poisoned mind. A queen's face was not her own. It was a symbol of her dynasty's health and power. Any blemish, any sign of age or sickness could be interpreted as a sign of weakness. Queen Elizabeth I of England understood this better than anyone. She ruled in a man's world. Her image had to be perfect, unchanging, and iconic. And for that, she turned to a cosmetic called Venetian ceruse. It was the foundation of her time, prized for its ability to create a perfectly white, smooth complexion. But this porcelain mask was made of white lead mixed with vinegar. Every day, a queen like Elizabeth would slather this toxic paste onto her face, neck, and chest. The immediate effect was what she wanted. It covered smallpox scars, of which Elizabeth had many. It hid wrinkles. It created the stark white look that was fashionable among the aristocracy, a look that said, "I do not toil in the sun." But the ceruse was a trap. Lead is a poison. It was absorbed directly through the skin. Over time, it caused skin to gray and shrivel. The very thing used to create beauty was destroying it. As a queen's natural skin worsened, she needed to apply thicker and thicker layers of the lead makeup to hide the damage. It was a vicious cycle. The long-term effects were far worse. Lead poisoning, known as plumbism, attacks the nervous system. The symptoms were often subtle at first. They included fatigue, irritability, and abdominal pain. A queen might complain of digestive issues or a foul mood, never connecting it to the cosmetics she applied each morning. As the poisoning progressed, it could lead to memory loss, cognitive decline, and severe mood swings. Some historians speculate that Elizabeth I's infamous temper and paranoia in her later years were worsened by decades of lead absorption. It could also cause hair loss. The queen's receding hairline, so prominent in her later portraits, may have been a direct result of her makeup. Removing the ceruse was another ordeal. It was a thick, caked-on substance. To get it off, a mixture containing mercury, another toxic heavy metal, was sometimes used. So, a queen would poison herself putting the makeup on, and poison herself again taking it off. Other removers were made of eggshells, alum, and honey. These concoctions were abrasive and would have been scraped across the delicate skin of the face, further damaging it. The pressure for a perfect appearance was not unique to Elizabeth. Mary, Queen of Scots, and other royal women across Europe used similar lead-based cosmetics. They were chasing an ideal of beauty that was literally killing them. They were powerful monarchs, but they were also victims of the limited and dangerous science of their day. They chose to wear a mask of power, unaware that the mask was slowly, methodically poisoning both body and mind. The desire to project an image of perfect health was so strong that they embraced a daily ritual that guaranteed the opposite. Number 16, could a cure be worse than the disease? For centuries, one of the most feared diseases was syphilis. It was rampant across Europe, affecting everyone from commoners to kings. It was known as the Great Pox, and its symptoms were devastating. It could cause painful sores, rashes, blindness, and eventually madness and death. And for a queen, the implications were terrifying. An unfaithful king could bring the disease into the royal bedchamber, threatening not only the queen's life, but the legitimacy and health of any future heir. The premier treatment for this dreaded disease was mercury. Mercury is a neurotoxin. It is one of the most poisonous non-radioactive elements on Earth. But for doctors from the 15th to the early 20th century, its violent effects on the body were seen as a sign that it was working. They believed it purged the disease from the system. A queen diagnosed with syphilis, or even just suspected of having it, would be subjected to a brutal mercury regimen. There were several ways to administer it. It could be mixed into an ointment and rubbed directly onto the skin, especially on the sores. It could be ingested in the form of a pill calomel, which was mercury chloride, or in one of the most dangerous methods, it could be vaporized over a fire, forcing the patient to inhale the toxic fumes. The immediate side effect was extreme salivation. The mercury would cause the salivary glands to go into overdrive, and patients would drool uncontrollably. They would need bowls to catch the constant stream of saliva. This was considered a good sign. Doctors believed the drool was the disease, the IBAP bad humors, leaving the body. A patient might be expected to produce several pints of saliva a day. This process was incredibly dehydrating and exhausting, but that was just the beginning. Mercury poisoning had a host of other horrific effects. It caused the gums to rot and swell. A queen's teeth would loosen and fall out. Her breath would become unbearably foul. It could cause severe neurological damage, leading to tremors, known as mercury shakes. It could affect the mind, causing irritability, depression, and eventually the very madness the disease itself could cause. The phrase "mad as a hatter" comes from the 19th century, when hat makers used mercury to treat felt and often suffered from its neurological effects. A queen undergoing this treatment would have been isolated not just because of her disease, but because of the cure. The process was foul, debilitating, and disfiguring. She would be in constant pain, unable to eat properly because of her ruined mouth, her body shaking, her mind clouded. Many people died not from the syphilis itself, but from mercury poisoning. They were literally poisoned to death in an attempt to save them. As royal physicians doing what they thought was best prescribed this treatment for generations. They saw the violent reaction and believed it was a fight between the medicine and the illness. They didn't understand that the medicine was often the more powerful enemy. For a queen, this cure meant trading one slow, agonizing decay for another. Number 15. Why would a queen willingly drink from a poisoned cup? In the grand courts of Europe, particularly in 17th century France under Louis XIV, the inner workings of the body were an obsession. Health was thought to depend on the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Sickness was a sign of imbalance. The logical solution was to get the bad stuff out. This led to a medical culture centered on purging, and one of the most potent tools for this was antimony. Antimony is a metalloid, a toxic substance. In small doses, it is a violent emetic, meaning it makes you vomit. It was prepared for medical use in a rather peculiar way. Antimony cups, or purgative cups, were cast from the metal. A queen's physician would fill the cup with wine and let it sit for a day or two. The acid in the wine would leach a small amount of antimony into the liquid. The queen would then drink the wine. The result was predictable hours of violent, wrenching vomiting. This was not seen as a side effect. It was the entire point. The act of vomiting was called a purge. It was believed to cleanse the stomach and rebalance the humors. A queen might be prescribed this treatment for anything from a fever to indigestion to melancholy. If she felt sluggish or unwell, the first course of action was often to empty her system forcefully. The experience would have been completely debilitating. While her courtiers were engaged in balls and political intrigue, the queen might be confined to her chambers, weak and retching into a bowl, attended by her ladies-in-waiting. The danger was immense. The line between a therapeutic dose and a lethal one was razor thin. Too much antimony, or a body weakened by other illnesses, could turn a purge into a fatal poisoning. It could cause cramping, dehydration, and heart failure. But its use was widespread. Louis XIV himself was a great proponent of antimony, surviving multiple treatments. His faith in the substance made it highly fashionable at court. His queen, Maria Theresa of Spain, and other royal women would have been subjected to the same treatments as a matter of routine. Beyond the cups, antimony was also prepared into pills called everlasting pills. These were small balls of metallic antimony that were swallowed. They were designed to irritate the digestive tract, causing vomiting and diarrhea before passing through the system whole. Because they were not digested, these pills were considered highly economical. They could be recovered from the chamber pot, washed, and reused by another family member. It is unlikely a queen would have reused a pill, but the practice illustrates the strange thinking of the time. They were swallowing a poison, expelling it, and then saving it for later. For a queen surrounded by the finest food and wine, this medical ritual was a brutal reminder of the primitive understanding of the human body. She would willingly poison herself, believing it was the only way to get well. Number 14, would you wear a dead toad to fend off the plague? The Black Death and subsequent outbreaks of plague were the single greatest terror for centuries. The disease was swift, brutal, and almost always fatal. It wiped out huge portions of the population and did not discriminate between peasant and royalty. When the plague came to a city, queens and kings were just as vulnerable as their subjects. In the face of such an overwhelming and mysterious threat, medicine and magic became hopelessly intertwined. And this led to some truly strange preventative measures, including the use of dried toads. The theory was based on a principle called sympathetic magic. The idea was that an object could draw out or absorb something similar to it. Toads were seen as foul, poisonous, and connected to the earth. It was believed they had a natural affinity for poison, therefore a toad could be used to draw the plague poison out of the air or out of a person's body before it could take root. The preparation was specific and grim. A live toad would be hung by its legs in a chimney. The heat and smoke would slowly dry it out and kill it. After it was completely desiccated, the toad would be ground into a powder or more commonly placed in a small silk or velvet bag. A queen, desperate to protect herself and her children, would wear this bag around her neck as an amulet. The dried toad would lie against her skin, a grotesque charm meant to ward off an invisible killer. Some physicians took it a step further. If a person was already showing signs of the plague, like the telltale buboes, swollen lymph nodes, a live toad would be placed directly on the swelling. It was believed the toad would draw the poison into its own body. According to the medical texts of the time, the toad would swell up and eventually burst, having absorbed the venom of the plague. Then, another toad would be applied, and another, until the patient was cured. Of course, this never worked. The patient would die, and the toads would die from being held against infected tissue. Imagine a queen in her opulent chambers, the air thick with the scent of burning herbs, meant to purify it. She is wearing jewels and fine silks, but hidden beneath it all is a small bag containing the shriveled corpse of a toad. It's a constant, morbid reminder of the death that lurks outside the palace walls. It represents the utter helplessness of the most powerful people on earth. You know, they had armies, wealth, and divine right, but against a microscopic bacillus, their only defense was folklore and a dead amphibian. This wasn't just a folk remedy. It was prescribed by learned physicians. It was a mainstream medical strategy. For a queen living in fear, wearing a dead toad was not a disgusting act of superstition. It was a rational, if desperate, act of self-preservation. Number 13, could swallowing human bone cure your ailments? For hundreds of years, one of the most sought-after and expensive medicines in a royal apothecary was not an herb or a mineral. It was ground-up human remains. This practice, known as corpse medicine, was a form of cannibalism that was considered perfectly acceptable and highly scientific. These queens and other nobles would ingest powders, tinctures, and balms made from human skulls, bones, and blood, believing they held potent healing properties. The most prized ingredient was mummy powder, or mumia. This was made from the preserved bodies of ancient Egyptians, which were looted from their tombs and shipped to Europe. Pharmacists would buy the mummies whole and grind them into a dark, crumbly powder. The theory was that the bitumen and resins used in the mummification process had powerful medicinal qualities. It was also believed that the spirit or life force of the person could be consumed, granting vitality to the patient. And a queen with a headache, a dizzy spell, or internal bleeding might be prescribed a dose of mummy powder, which she would mix with wine or water and drink. It was incredibly expensive, a medicine literally fit for a king. or queen. Another popular treatment was made from human skulls. Specifically, the skull of a young man who had died a violent death was considered the most potent. The idea was that his life force was suddenly trapped in the body at its peak. The moss that grew on these discarded skulls, known as usnea, was particularly valued as a treatment for nosebleeds and seizures. The skull itself would be ground into a powder called cranium humanum. Queen Mary II of England was reportedly given a dose of this on her deathbed. It did not work. Blood was also considered a powerful medicine. The fresh blood of a recently executed person was thought to cure epilepsy. While it's unlikely a queen would have stood at the foot of the scaffold with a cup, tinctures made from dried blood were common. Human fat, rendered from corpses, was used to make ointments for muscle aches and pains. Every part of the body was seen as a potential cure for something. This wasn't a secret, shameful practice. It was openly discussed in medical texts. Royal physicians like Jean de Renou, who served King Louis Xi of France, wrote detailed instructions on how to select and prepare human remains for medicinal use. The practice was rooted in the idea that the body contained a vital spirit, and consuming parts of a healthy body could replenish one's own. It was a gruesome form of recycling. A queen, taking her daily dose of medicine, might be swallowing the dust of an Egyptian pharaoh or a young soldier, believing it was the most advanced medical treatment available to her. She was consuming the dead to stay alive. Number 12, why would a queen want her gown lined with weasel fur? The life of a royal queen was a paradox of public duty and private suffering. One of the greatest duties, and greatest sources of suffering, was childbirth. Producing a male heir was paramount. A queen's entire worth was often tied to her ability to get pregnant and deliver a healthy son. The process was fraught with danger. Miscarriages were common, and death in childbirth was a constant threat. In the quest to ensure a successful pregnancy and birth, queens and their doctors turned to a wide array of remedies and talismans, many of which seem bizarre today. One of the strangest was the use of weasels. According to ancient and medieval medical beliefs, the weasel was associated with pregnancy and childbirth. This belief stemmed from a misunderstanding of the animal's biology. It was thought that the weasel conceived through its ear and gave birth through its mouth. While anatomically incorrect, this idea made the weasel a powerful symbol of an easy and unconventional birth. Therefore, anything related to a weasel was thought to help a human pregnancy. A pregnant queen might be advised to wear a pouch containing the powdered testicles of a weasel. Or, more elaborately, she might have the fur of a weasel sewn into the lining of her birthing gown. The idea was that the essence of the weasel's easy birth would be transferred to her. Another common practice involved the eagle stone, or atites. This was a type of geode, a hollow rock with loose pebbles inside that would rattle when shaken. It was believed that this stone, which held a baby inside it, could prevent miscarriages. A queen would have these stones tied to her arm or thigh throughout her pregnancy. When labor began, the stone would be moved down to her leg to help draw the baby out. Queen Elizabeth of York, mother of Henry V, reportedly used such a stone. The birthing chamber itself was a tightly controlled, ritualized space. It was usually a dark, hot, and airless room, and windows and keyholes would be covered to prevent drafts or evil spirits from entering. The queen would be attended only by women midwives and her ladies in waiting. Male physicians were typically only called in if things went catastrophically wrong, and even then, their presence was controversial. During the agonizingly long hours of labor, a queen would be given a variety of concoctions to speed things along. These could include drinks laced with crushed ants' eggs or oils intended to make the womb slippery. If the birth was obstructed, the midwife might resort to physically manipulating the baby, a dangerous and painful process for both mother and child. For a queen like Anne Boleyn or Catherine of Aragon, each pregnancy was a high-stakes gamble. A successful birth meant security and power. A miscarriage or the birth of a daughter meant failure and disgrace. In that desperate context, lining a gown with weasel fur or clutching a special rock was not just superstition. It was a desperate attempt to control an uncontrollable and life-threatening process. Number 11. Could a snail slime soothe a royal cough? Common ailments like coughs, colds, and sore throats were a constant nuisance, even for royalty. Without antibiotics or modern cough suppressants, these minor illnesses could linger for weeks or develop into more serious conditions like pneumonia. Physicians developed a vast pharmacopoeia of remedies using herbs, minerals, and a variety of animal products. Among the most popular and most slimy of these ingredients were snails and slugs. The use of snails in medicine was based on the doctrine of signatures, a theory that held that the appearance of a plant or animal gave a clue to its medicinal use. The long, slimy trail left by a snail was thought to resemble phlegm. Therefore, it was believed that snails could help with respiratory ailments by soothing the throat and lungs. A queen suffering from a persistent cough might be prescribed a snail-based syrup. The preparation was simple but unappetizing. A number of snails would be crushed, shell and all, and boiled with sugar and herbs to create a thick, sweet syrup. This would be taken by the spoonful several times a day. Another method involved snail water. This was a distilled concoction. Snails would be washed and placed in a still with a variety of herbs, and sometimes earthworms, and then heated. The resulting condensed liquid was bottled and used as a cure all for coughs and consumption tuberculosis. The recipe for snail water appeared in official pharmacopoeias and domestic recipe books for centuries. The court of King Charles II of England was known to use it. Beyond internal use, snail slime was also a popular topical treatment. It was believed to be excellent for the skin. A queen concerned about her complexion might have a facial treatment that involved letting live snails crawl across her face, leaving their trail of slime behind. This was thought to moisturize the skin, reduce inflammation, and heal blemishes. While it may seem strange, modern science has actually found some merit in this. Snail mucin is rich in proteins, hyaluronic acid, and glycolic acid, ingredients that are now found in many high-end skincare products. The old physicians were right about its benefits, even if their reasoning was flawed, but the internal use was far more dubious. Consuming raw or improperly cooked snails carried a risk of parasitic infection, including rat lungworm, which can cause meningitis. While the boiling process for syrups would have likely killed any parasites, the thought of drinking crushed snails is still jarring. For a queen accustomed to the finest cuisine, being handed a spoonful of snail syrup for her cough was a humbling and unpleasant experience. It was a sticky, slimy, and gross reminder that when it came to medicine, everyone, regardless of rank, was subject to the strange and often disgusting treatments of the day. Number 10 was animal dung the secret to a royal poultice. In an age before antiseptics and antibiotics, any open wound, cut, or sore could become a deadly source of infection. Physicians were constantly searching for substances that could draw out infection, reduce swelling, and promote healing. Their search led them to some of the most readily available yet repulsive materials imaginable: animal feces. Poultices and plasters made from dung were a common medical treatment for centuries, applied to the bodies of both commoners and queens. The most highly prized type of dung was album graecum, which translates to Greek white. This was the white, dried excrement of dogs that had been fed a diet of bones. The resulting feces were rich in calcium phosphate. Physicians believed it had powerful anti-inflammatory and drying properties. It would be powdered and mixed with honey or other substances to form a paste. This paste would be spread on a cloth and applied to a sore throat, a wound, or an inflamed joint. A queen suffering from tonsillitis might have a bandage smeared with dog excrement tied around her neck. Peacock dung was also considered to have special properties, particularly for treating epilepsy and seizures. It would be dried, powdered, and mixed into a drink for the patient to swallow. The droppings of pigeons, pigs, and goats were also used in various preparations. The reasoning was often tied to the animal's diet or perceived nature. For instance, goose dung was sometimes used because geese were noisy, and it was thought this could help with tinnitus or ringing in the ears. The application of these dung-based poultices was a messy and foul-smelling affair. Imagine a queen lying in her silk-draped bed, her chamber filled with the stench of a warm animal dung plaster applied to her body. Her attendants would have to prepare and apply the mixture, trying to mask the odor with perfumes and burning incense. While the intention was to heal, the reality was that applying feces to an open wound was incredibly dangerous. It introduced a host of bacteria, dramatically increasing the risk of tetanus and sepsis. Some historical texts suggest a poultice made from fresh, warm cow dung was used to help with childbirth, applied to the abdomen to ease the pain. Catherine the Great of Russia, who was famously interested in medicine and science, may have encountered physicians who still prescribed such remedies, even in the more enlightened 18th century. The practice was deeply rooted in ancient medical traditions passed down from Greek and Roman physicians. For a royal patient, it was a disgusting but accepted part of medical care. They endured the smell and the filth in the hope that it would save them from the much greater fear of a festering, incurable infection. Number 9. What could a queen's urine reveal to her doctor? For a physician in the pre-modern era, the single most important diagnostic tool was a flask of the patient's urine. The practice of uroscopy or water casting was a complex art. A doctor would be called to the queen's bedside, and he would be presented with a sample of her urine in a special glass flask. He would not just glance at it, he would hold it up to the light, observing its color, clarity, and sediment. He would swirl it, noting its viscosity. He would even smell it and, in some cases, taste it. A detailed urine wheel, a circular diagram, linked different colors and consistencies of urine to specific imbalances of the four humors. For example, white, thick urine might indicate a problem with phlegm. Red or dark urine could suggest an excess of blood or black bile. A sweet taste, which we now know is a sign of diabetes, was noted by physicians as far back as the 17th century. They called it the honey urine sickness. For a queen, this process was a routine part of any medical consultation. Every aspect of her health was thought to be reflected in this single bodily fluid. A doctor's entire diagnosis for a fever, a pain, or a bout of melancholy could be based solely on his examination of her urine without ever physically touching the queen herself. This focus on urine went beyond diagnosis. In some cases, urine was also used as a treatment. This practice is known as urophagia or urine therapy. It was believed that urine contained a vital essence or spirit that could be reabsorbed to promote healing. A queen might be advised to drink her own urine as a health tonic. More commonly, it was used topically. It was considered an excellent antiseptic wash for wounds and sores. The ammonia in urine does have mild cleansing properties, so there was a tiny sliver of logic to this. It was also used as a gargle for a sore throat or as a skin treatment to clear up blemishes. Queen Elizabeth I courtier, Sir John Harrington, wrote about the benefits of washing the face with one's own urine each morning. The obsession with urine also played a critical role in determining pregnancy. Since there were no chemical pregnancy tests, doctors would try to divine the answer from a queen's urine. They might mix it with wine and observe the reaction. Some believed that a woman's urine would change the color of a leaf or cause a seed to sprout faster. These tests were, of course, completely unreliable. Queen Mary I of England, desperate for an heir, was the victim of at least 2 phantom pregnancies. Her doctors, likely based on uroscopy and the cessation of her periods, incorrectly confirmed her pregnancies. The entire country celebrated, only to be met with disappointment months later when no baby arrived. Her body had mimicked the signs of pregnancy, and the diagnostic tools of the day were too crude to tell the difference. For a queen, her urine was not a private matter. It was a public text to be read and interpreted by her physicians, holding what they believed were the secrets to her health, her fertility, and the future of the kingdom. Number 8. Why was the clyster a social ritual in the French court? The enema, or clyster as it was known, was a cornerstone of medical treatment for centuries. The goal was, once again, to purge the body of bad humors, but this time from the lower end. Nowhere was this practice more prevalent or fashionable than in the 17th century French court of King Louis XIV. The Sun King was a notorious hypochondriac and is said to have received over 2,000 enemas in his lifetime. His obsession made the procedure a routine, almost social, part of court life, and the queen was not exempt. A royal enema was not a private, discreet affair. The Queen, Maria Theresa, and other high-ranking ladies would receive their clysters as part of their daily routine, often while continuing to entertain guests or conduct business from their beds. The device itself was a large syringe, often made of pewter or silver, with a long nozzle. The liquid would be prepared by the apothecary. It was not just warm water. Recipes could be quite elaborate, containing infusions of herbs like chamomile or mallow, honey, bran, or even bile from an ox. The process was administered by an apothecary's assistant. The queen would lie on her side while the nozzle was inserted and the contents of the syringe were forcefully injected. It was an undignified and uncomfortable procedure, yet it was so commonplace that it lost much of its stigma. It was simply seen as an essential part of maintaining one's health and intestinal regularity. Playwrights like Molière even satirized the medical profession's obsession with clysters in his plays, a sign of how ingrained it was in the culture. The reasons for prescribing a clyster were endless. It was used for constipation, of course, but also for fevers, headaches, colds, and even bad moods. The theory was that many ailments originated in the gut. A buildup of foul matter in the intestines was thought to release toxic vapors that could travel up to the brain, causing confusion or melancholy. A good cleansing was the answer to everything. For a queen, who was constantly on display, this ritualized purging was just another part of the bizarre reality of court life. Her most intimate bodily functions were medicalized and managed by a team of people. She endured the discomfort and indignity because it was what the best doctors of her time recommended. It was a strange intersection of power and powerlessness. She could command armies and influence the fate of nations, but she could not refuse the apothecary who arrived at her bedside each morning with a large, liquid-filled syringe. Number 7, could a stone from a goat's stomach save you from poison? In a world of political intrigue and shifting allegiances, a monarch's greatest fear was not always illness or war. It was poison. A drop in a cup of wine or a pinch of powder in a meal could end a reign in an instant. This constant threat created a huge demand for antidotes, or counterpoisons. One of the most famous and valuable of these was the bezoar stone. A bezoar is not a mineral. It is a hard mass, a concretion, that forms in the stomach or intestines of certain animals, most commonly the bezoar goat of Persia. It is essentially a hairball made of layers of hair, plant fibers, and minerals that the animal's digestive system cannot pass. Over years, these layers compact into a smooth, hard, stone-like object. It was believed that these stones had the miraculous ability to neutralize any poison. The bezoar stone was one of the most precious items in a royal treasury, often valued more highly than diamonds or rubies. A queen would have one set in a piece of jewelry, like a ring or a pendant, so it was always close at hand. If she suspected her food or drink was poisoned, she could dip the stone into the cup or scrape a small amount of powder from it into her meal. It was also used as a general cure for a variety of ailments, from melancholy to the plague. Queen Elizabeth I was said to have kept a bezoar stone set in a silver ring. The belief in the bezoar's power was so strong that they were tested. The famous 16th century surgeon Ambroise Paré was skeptical. He witnessed a test where a cook who had been caught stealing was sentenced to death. The man was offered a deal he could be poisoned and then given a bezoar stone. If he survived, he would be freed. The man agreed. He was given a deadly poison, followed by the bezoar. He died in agony 7 hours later. Parry's experiment proved the stone was useless, but the belief in its power persisted for another 200 years. Why was the belief so strong? It likely stemmed from the stone's origin. It came from a pure herb-eating animal, and it had survived the poisonous digestive process. It was rare, exotic, and expensive, which always adds to a medicine's mystique. For a queen who lived with the constant low-level fear of assassination, the bezoar stone was a powerful psychological comfort. It was a tangible object that represented safety. Holding it or wearing it was a way of warding off an invisible threat. And it may have been medically useless, but its value as a talisman against fear was immeasurable. Number 6. What did it mean to be touched by a queen? Not all royal medical treatments involve the queen being a patient. In one of the most peculiar and long-lasting traditions, the queen herself was considered the medicine. This was the royal touch, a ceremony in which the monarch would touch people to cure them of a specific disease, scrofula. Scrofula, or the king's evil, is a form of tuberculosis that affects the lymph nodes in the neck, causing them to swell and sometimes burst through the skin, creating open sores. It was a chronic and disfiguring disease. The belief that a monarch's touch could cure it began in France and England in the Middle Ages. It was tied to the idea of the divine right of kings. The monarch was believed to be God's chosen representative on earth, and therefore possessed a semi-divine healing power. The ceremony was a highly organized and popular event. A queen, like Anne of England, the last British monarch to perform the ritual, would hold regular touching ceremonies. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of sick people would gather, waiting for their chance to be healed. The queen, attended by her clergy and physicians, would move down the line of sufferers. She would place her hands on the face and neck of each person, on their sores, while a chaplain recited prayers. Each person touched was then given a special gold coin, known as a touch piece or an angle, to wear around their neck to prevent the disease from returning. For the queen, this was a physically and emotionally draining duty. She would have to come into close contact with hundreds of sick, often impoverished people. She would have to touch oozing, infected sores. The risk of contracting a disease herself was very real. Yet it was a vital political tool. The ceremony reinforced her legitimacy and her special, God-given status. It was a powerful piece of public relations, demonstrating her piety and concern for her people. Did it work? Medically, no. But the placebo effect would have been immense. For a person suffering from a chronic illness, being personally touched by the queen and given a gold coin was an incredibly powerful psychological experience. Scrofula was also a disease that could have natural remissions, where the symptoms would temporarily improve on their own. If this happened after a royal touching, it would be hailed as a miracle. The famous writer Samuel Johnson was touched by Queen Anne for scrofula when he was a small boy. It did not cure him. He carried the scars for the rest of his life, but the tradition showed the unique place a queen occupied. She was not just a head of state. She was seen by many as a conduit for divine power. Her body was both a political entity and, in this strange ritual, a medical instrument. Number 5, could drilling a hole in a queen's head cure her sadness? Of all the ancient medical procedures, few are as dramatic or terrifying as trepanning. This is the act of drilling, cutting, or scraping a hole into the human skull. It is the oldest surgical procedure known to humanity, with evidence of it dating back to the Stone Age. And it persisted as a medical treatment well into the era of queens and empires. It was used to treat a range of conditions, from head injuries to epilepsy, but it was most commonly associated with ailments of the mind. The theory behind trepanning was based on the idea of pressure. For a physical head injury, it made some sense. Drilling a hole could relieve pressure from swelling or bleeding on the brain, but the same logic was applied to mental and emotional problems. A queen suffering from severe headaches, seizures, or deep melancholy, what we would now call depression, might be told that evil spirits or bad humors were trapped inside her head. The solution was to create an opening to let them out. A royal surgeon would perform the procedure. The queen would be held down, likely having been given alcohol or opium to dull the pain, but she would be conscious. The surgeon would use a hand-crank drill or a sharp instrument to slowly bore through the bone of her skull, being careful not to puncture the delicate membrane covering the brain. It was an incredibly risky procedure. The chance of infection was huge. A slip of the surgeon's hand could be fatal, but many people survived it. Archaeologists have found numerous ancient skulls with trepanned holes that show signs of bone regrowth, meaning the person lived for years after the surgery. While direct evidence of a specific queen undergoing trepanning is scarce, it was a known medical option for the conditions they frequently suffered. The pressures of court life, the grief of losing children, and the political anxieties could easily lead to the kinds of symptoms chronic headaches, depression, erratic behavior for which trepanning was prescribed. Isabella of Castile, for example, was known to suffer from profound bouts of depression later in her life. And Joanna of Castile, her daughter, was famously confined for decades due to her mental instability, which was called madness. The physicians of their time would have considered trepanning a valid, if extreme, treatment option. The small circle of bone removed from the skull was often kept by the patient and worn as an amulet to ward off evil spirits. For a queen who survived this brutal surgery, she would be left with a permanent hole in her head, covered only by her scalp. It was a drastic and violent solution to a problem that doctors did not understand. It represents the ultimate desperation of both patient and physician willing to physically open the skull to try and heal the mind within. Number 4. How many leeches could a queen endure? For well over 2,000 years, the dominant medical theory in the Western world was humorism. The idea that the body was filled with 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health depended on their balance. Sickness was caused by a surplus of one humor, and the most common surplus was thought to be of blood. The solution was simple: remove some. This led to the ubiquitous practice of bloodletting, and one of its most popular methods was the application of leeches. A queen feeling unwell, whether from a fever, anxiety, or indigestion, would likely have her physician recommend hirudotherapy or leeching. The leeches used for this purpose were a specific species, Hirudo medicinalis. Apothecaries kept them in jars, and they were a standard part of any medical kit. The process was straightforward. The leeches would be placed on the queen's skin, often on her temples for a headache, her chest for a respiratory issue, or near an inflamed joint. The leech would attach itself with its suckers and use its 3 jaws, lined with tiny teeth, to make a Y-shaped incision. It would then inject an anticoagulant, hirudin, to keep the blood flowing freely. The leech would feed until it was engorged, swelling to several times its original size, at which point it would simply fall off. A single leech could consume about 10 to 15 milliliters of blood, but a typical treatment would involve multiple leeches, sometimes dozens at a time. The queen would lie in her bed with these dark, slimy creatures attached to her body, slowly draining her blood. The bites themselves were not very painful, but the experience would have been psychologically unsettling. After the leeches detached, the wounds would continue to bleed for hours because of the anticoagulant, requiring bandages to soak up the excess blood. Leeching was used for everything. For a hysterical or overly emotional queen, leeches might be applied to her inner thighs. For menstrual problems, they could be applied directly to the cervix, a procedure that would have been both painful and dangerous. Queen Victoria herself was known to use leeches, though by her time, their use was becoming more targeted for specific inflammations. In earlier centuries, however, it was a cure-all. The problem, of course, was that this constant removal of blood often made the patient weaker, not stronger. It led to anemia, fatigue, and fainting. In a patient already weakened by illness, a vigorous leeching could be fatal. But the theory was so deeply ingrained that if a patient got worse after leeching, the doctor would often conclude that they hadn't removed enough blood and would apply even more leeches. For a queen, this treatment was a regular part of her life, a disgusting but necessary ritual to maintain her humoral balance and, supposedly, her health. Number 3, could a plaster of pigeon parts cure a royal headache? The poultice, or plaster, was a staple of pre-modern medicine. It was a way to apply medication directly to the skin over an afflicted area. While some poultices were made of herbs, many recipes called for ingredients that were far more visceral. One common treatment for headaches, vertigo, or even mental illness involved a plaster made from pigeons. The procedure, as described in medical texts, was specific and grisly. A live pigeon would be taken and either plucked or split down the middle. The warm, still bleeding bird would then be applied directly to the patient's head, or sometimes their feet. The idea was that the vital spirits of the pigeon would draw the sickness out of the body. The heat and life force of the freshly killed animal were considered key to the treatment. A queen suffering from a migraine or a fever would be lying in her bed while her physician performed this strange ritual. The feeling of the warm, bloody bird against her skin would have been shocking. The smell would have been strong. The entire process was messy and primitive, yet it was based on a complex medical theory. It was believed that illness could be transferred from a higher being, a human, to a lower one, an animal. The pigeon was, in effect, a sacrifice for the queen's health. This type of transference medicine was common. To treat a fever, a piece of meat might be placed on the patient's body and then fed to a dog, with the belief that the fever would pass into the animal. For gout, a painful inflammation of the joints, a poultice might be made and then buried in the ground, symbolically burying the disease with it. The pigeon plaster was particularly popular for ailments of the head. It was thought that since pigeons were birds of the air, they had a special connection to the head, the highest part of the body. This followed the doctrine of signatures, where like treats like. A queen like Queen Anne, who suffered from chronic ill health and gout, or George III's wife, Queen Charlotte, who had to deal with her husband's bouts of mental illness, would have been surrounded by physicians who prescribed such treatments. While her husband was being subjected to his own brutal therapies, a plaster of warm pigeon parts might have been applied to her own head to calm her nerves and ease her worried mind. It was a bloody, bizarre, and ultimately useless treatment, born from a desperate need to find a cure for things no one understood. Number 2. Why did queens endure blistering? In the humoral theory of medicine, sometimes just removing bad humors was not enough. Sometimes you had to draw them out of a specific part of the body. This led to the painful and disfiguring practice of creating therapeutic blisters. It was thought that a blister, a pocket of fluid, was a physical manifestation of the bad humor being pulled from the flesh. And one of the most common ways to create these blisters was with canthorides, better known as Spanish fly. Spanish fly is not a fly, it is a powder made from the dried, crushed bodies of a specific type of iridescent green beetle. This powder contains a powerful blistering agent called cantharidin. For medical use, it would be mixed into a plaster or ointment. If a queen was suffering from a deep pain in a joint, a respiratory illness, or even a coma, her physician might apply a Spanish fly plaster to her skin. It could be placed on her back, her chest, or even the back of her neck or scalp. Within a few hours, the plaster would cause severe irritation. The skin would redden, and a large, painful blister would form. This was considered a great success. The clear or yellowish fluid that filled the blister was believed to be the noxious humor that was causing the illness, now safely drawn out of the body. The physician would then puncture the blister to drain the fluid, leaving behind a raw, open wound. To keep the drainage going, this wound would often be deliberately irritated with other substances, preventing it from healing for days or even weeks. The experience was agonizing. The blistering agent caused intense burning pain. The resulting wound was prone to infection, which could be far more dangerous than the original ailment. Yet, this practice known as vesication was used for centuries. King George III famously endured numerous blisterings during his periods of mental illness in an attempt to draw the madness out of his brain. His wife, Queen Charlotte, would have had to witness this painful and ineffective treatment. It was also used on Queen Caroline of Ansbach in her final illness. Blistering was a form of counter-irritation. The idea was that creating a new superficial pain and inflammation would distract the body from a deeper, more serious one. It was like fighting fire with fire. For a queen, this treatment meant trading her original symptoms for a painful, oozing, and permanent scar. It was a testament to the belief that healing had to be a violent, painful process. The more a treatment hurt, the more it was believed to be working. Number 1, why was draining a queen's blood the answer to everything? Of all the gross and misguided medical treatments in history, none was more common, more enduring, or more deadly than bloodletting. For over 2 millennia, from ancient Greece until the late 19th century, phlebotomy was the answer to almost every medical problem. A fever, bloodletting, infection, bloodletting, childbirth complications, bloodletting, melancholy, bloodletting. A queen throughout her entire life would have been bled for countless reasons, often weakening her when she most needed her strength. The procedure was typically done in one of 2 ways. The most common was venesection, where a physician or barber surgeon would use a small knife called a lancet to make an incision in a vein, usually in the arm. The blood would be drained into a bowl, and the amount removed would be carefully measured. A typical bloodletting might remove a pint of blood, but in severe cases, far more could be taken. The second method was cupping, where a heated glass cup was placed on the skin. As the air in the cup cooled, it created a vacuum that drew blood to the surface. The area would then be cut with a lancet to release the bad blood. The logic was rooted in humoral theory. An excess of blood was believed to cause heat, fever, and redness. By removing blood, the body could be cooled and rebalanced. The practice was so routine that almanacs included charts showing the best days of the month and the best parts of the body to bleed for specific ailments, all tied to the positions of the stars and planets. A queen in childbirth was in particular danger. Pregnancy was considered a hot and wet condition, and bloodletting was often performed during the 9 months to keep the queen's humors in check. If labor was difficult, she would be bled to reduce inflammation. After the birth, she would be bled again to prevent postpartum fever. Queen Anne, who suffered through at least 17 pregnancies that ended in miscarriage, stillbirth, or infant death, would have been bled repeatedly in desperate attempts to save her children and herself. Each time, the treatment would have left her anemic and less able to cope with the physical trauma of pregnancy. The death of King Charles II of England is a famous example of bloodletting taken to the extreme. When he had a seizure, his team of physicians subjected him to a torturous series of treatments that began with letting a pint of blood from his arm. Over the next few days, he was bled, repeatedly blistered, purged, and given enemas. He died, likely hastened to his grave by the very men trying to save him. The queens who witnessed such events, like his wife Catherine of Braganza, could do little but trust the learned men in whose hands their lives rested. Bloodletting finally fell out of favor in the late 19th century as a new scientific understanding of disease and the circulatory system emerged. But for centuries, it was the first and last resort of doctors. For the most powerful women in the world, surrounded by every imaginable luxury, their medical care was often a brutal series of draining, poisoning, and purging. Their health and their very lives were at the mercy of traditions that were as dangerous as they were disgusting.